A Superman action figure in a toy coffin, a blue shirt and red jacket, a first flight in the sun above the Arctic tundra. These are some of the moments that define my Superman fandom. Together on this podcast, we journey across time and media to examine, discover, and reconsider the creative visions that have shaped the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman in the Golden Age is returning guest, Mike Sangregorio. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm happy to have you back. Just a really quick postscript to our last episode. You and I had a discussion about Tom Welling's return appearance as the Clark Kent of Smallville in television's Crisis adaptation. And it was a great discussion, and I feel like we both made our positions clear. We felt differently about the way his fate unfolded during Crisis. But after I was done, after we finished the episode, I was kicking myself because I said, how did I miss the perfect opportunity to drop this legendary Smallville quote as spoken by Lex Luthor in the series finale? You and I, Mike, we saw that Crisis ep scene very differently. You and I, we have a destiny together, only on different sides. I had to get that out of my system there, so I wanted to take care of that right off the bat there.
I understand and I appreciate that.
Thanks. So we are here to talk about Superman in the Golden Age. You and I have read a selection of stories from the late 30s and 40s. We've watched some episodes of the Fleischer cartoon. We reread the beginning part of Grant Morrison's New 52 Action Comics run, where he molded his Superman very much after the Golden Age incarnation of the character. So we're going to be talking all about that, and I have a lot that I want to share, but I want to toss it to you first, because you've been on the show now a number of times. Like I said, you came on, we talked about Smallville, we've talked about Superman and Lois, we've talked about the Jeff Loeb era of the comics. But there's one question I haven't actually asked you yet, and I was saving it for this episode because it's a big question. I think this is the appropriate place to ask it. What is your Superman fan journey? And in particular, what role does the Golden Age incarnation of the character play in your journey as a Superman fan?
Sure. So I started reading comics in 1991, and for anyone who is even remotely familiar with Superman, you're going to know that the early 90s were not very good to Superman. He got murdered, and then he had long hair for some reason. Actually, not some reason. I'm a huge fan of Dan Jurgens. But it was rough, and I am a Marvel fan. I like Spider-Man, I like the X-Men, and I never really connected with Superman. I only read the books sporadically, but it was when I read the novel The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon that I had a better appreciation for the golden age of comic books, which that is a fictional account of. So I went back and I did some research on Golden Age Superman, which was a character I didn't know really anything about. And I found a much more interesting prototype of the version of Superman that you and I would meet later on, especially in the 90s when we started reading comics. And that one connected with me. And I've always, since then, for the past 15 years or so, I really am into that version of the character because he is relevant. He's very much a social crusader. He's very much for something and about something. But also, he is much less powerful than the current version of Superman, who I believe you can tell good stories about, but I find that one to be a little bit more relatable. He gets tossed around, he gets thrown around, he gets angry. But the end result is that character only existed for a few years. I mean, really, Superman premiered in 1938, and it's arguable that by the end of World War II, he's a very different character. And that's not a bad thing. But I personally found that was very interesting. And going back to that original character, I saw at least, how easily he inspired an entire genre, right? Like Superman created the superhero genre as we understand it today. And you can see that there because he gives you adventure and scale and pathos in a way that nothing else at that time was giving. So it was kind of this epiphany for me. And then in 2011, of course, Grant Morrison created the New 52 version, which brought that back. And since Grant Morrison is one of my favorite creators, I felt very validated in a lot of that. So I have a joke with a friend of ours that my favorite version of Superman is basically anything Max Fleischer did, and then outside of that, I don't particularly love the character.
Well, the fact that your Superman fandom has its limitations, I think has made for interesting discussions when you've come on the show, and I always value and appreciate getting your insight here in terms of your love of the Golden Age character. Man, I'm right there with you. I gotta tell you something. I could easily do episode after episode of this podcast talking about, the Loeb era and the Snyder movies and Smallville, and I'd be perfectly content, and it'd be a lot of fun, and I could easily fill episode after episode with that. But I wanted, as the host, as the podcaster, as the Superman fan, I wanted to push myself, and I wanted to explore new aspects of the character that I really hadn't before, or that I maybe didn't fully appreciate the first time, but now I might upon a reread or a rewatch. And this episode, to me, I've been so excited all week, and I know I say I'm excited about every episode. I am. It's true. I wouldn't do it if I weren't excited, but this one in particular, I was so excited, and this episode just so perfectly, I think, for me as the podcaster, encapsulates why I'm doing this show. Because, prior to this, I had read Action 1, as I think most Superman fans do at some point, and that was about it as far as Golden Age goes. And even Bronze and Silver and Bronze, even to this point, I've read very little of. The recent shift was a few episodes ago. Our mutual friend, Rich Roney, he came on the show, and we broke down all the pre-crisis origin tellings. So I read now a decent bunch of Gold and Silver and Bronze Age stories, but again, within the context of the tellings of the origin, not so much the standard adventure. So, going into this episode, I guess I didn't have so much in the way of preconceived notions, other than, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't really expecting to enjoy the stories as much as I did. I really felt that I would come at this from an historical and academic perspective, and I would look at it, again, more in that academic sense, and just sort of looking at the evolution of the character and the way the stories were told. And I was just so pleasantly surprised at how much I enjoyed those earliest stories. And not to knock the rest of the Golden Age, but there's definitely a shift as America enters World War II and comes out of World War II. It's a very noticeable change in the types of stories and the way the stories are told. But those earliest issues, you hit the nail on the head. You said something that I was thinking as I was reading these stories over the past few nights. They were about something. Like, there was a very specific point of view, and the stories had teeth. I mean, like, they really packed a punch. So this was just an absolute joy and revelation to read, really, for the first time, most of these stories. And, even with Action 1, I know most Superman fans and comics fans generally, right? The image of Action 1, that cover, seared into all of our brains, right? And beyond that, a lot of us probably think of that one-page origin at the very beginning of Action 1. But I don't know how many people, necessarily think about what immediately follows that. And it's so, the rest of that first issue so perfectly sets the stage for what those stories are going to be like. So, again, this was just an absolute joy, and I'm glad to have you along for this ride.
Yeah, I was very excited when you said that this was something you want to talk about, because usually this is one of those subjects that I'll go on and on about. And people who read comics are like, "Wait, what are you talking about? These are from the '30s, right?" And I get polite stares, but to actually have someone go back and read these things, and when I realized you were enjoying them, I was very excited, because for a while I thought you were going to be like, "Okay, he's just weird," but no, it's good to know that this really landed for you.
I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but I enjoy these so much that, this version of the character doesn't take my top spot. I mean, I still, in comics, certainly, I still gravitate towards, obviously I started with Death of Superman, so I do have a fondness for that general era, and then specifically the early 2000s, the Loeb, Kelly, Birthright period. That's still number one for me, but this is probably number two. I just was so taken by these stories, and we'll get into all of that. And just to sort of set the stage for our audience here in terms of what we're going to be talking about, if you go on Wikipedia, as I did, to look at the breakdown, the exact breakdown of the Golden, Silver, and Bronze Ages, typically, right, Golden Age is considered 38 to about 56. That's at least what's on Wikipedia. That being said, I did some further reading and research, and the late 40s into the early to mid 50s is often considered a bit of a period of flux, sort of like an in-between that doesn't quite fit, for Superman at least in particular, that doesn't really quite fit so totally into the Golden or the Silver Age. And that's something that I think Rich and I will pick up a bit next episode. He's going to come on again, and we're going to talk about Silver Age, which is his favorite era of the character. So for this, I mean, most of the stories that I read, at least, were from the 38 to 48 period, truly the heart of the Golden Age for Superman. And then, like I said before, we will talk about the Fleischer cartoons and the recent Morrison run. The thing with the Fleischer cartoons, and I know we'll get more specific with all of this, but this reinforced something that I was thinking about when we did our Origins episode, which is until recently, until doing this podcast, I kind of didn't fully appreciate just how important those adaptations were early on in shaping the character. Right. And as much as I knew, there was a radio show and there were the Fleischer cartoons. It wasn't until I really thought about this and actually started reading and watching everything to fully appreciate the fact that within a couple of years of the character's birth, he has just permeated all forms of media. In that Origins episode, Rich and I talked about a 1942 novel called Adventures of Superman by George Lothar. It's the whole telling of the origin. Hence why we talked about it in that episode. But so there too, so it's novels and newspaper strips and the radio show and the Fleischer cartoon. And then in the 50s, we get the George Reeves TV series. So within a relatively short amount of time, you have this character all over the place. And I certainly really came to appreciate how those other incarnations of the character, how formative they were for the public at large. And it's the sort of thing that I guess in the past, I just didn't fully appreciate, like how much he was out there so early.
Yeah, and it's not even that he was just in all these things. I mean, in addition to his 2 books, he had Action, and then shortly thereafter he had Superman comics. But he also had a comic strip, and he had all these other things you were talking about, and they worked together. Like the radio show, the Fleischer cartoons, the comic strip, anything else that was going on, they our version of the character, when we look back in there, is a tapestry made of all of those different things, because Jimmy Olsen, Kryptonite, the villains, the names, they're all intermingled. Like, it didn't really settle down until you get to the end of the Golden Age, but the version of the character that exists in Action Comics #1 and the version that exists at the end is again, it's this overlap of all these different stories because they all hit people at different times. I'm sure there were fans of the character who went off to war or who came back from war who only knew him from the radio, and that's a valid interpretation. In the same way of people who probably just read it in the newspaper as a strip because they were too old to read a comic. So the fact that the character was able to quickly expand all these mediums, or media, or whatever the word is, and then coalesce as DC National realized, this is going to be a thing we have for the rest of time, is really important because it means that it wasn't just the comic, and it also shows why so many other characters from that period of time, again, are not still being published 80 years later. I mean, how many characters existed during the Golden Age who were very good? I mean, it's not a quality thing. It's just when you hit a wider audience, you get more recognition and you can stick around for a while. The thing I always point to is Captain Marvel, right? Like Captain Marvel, the modern day Shazam, was more popular than Superman for a lot of this time, but he couldn't last that long, and so he kind of gets stuck back then, where Superman gets to evolve. And it's always been like Superman's adaptability has always been one of his biggest things, and it starts here right at the outset. It's built into the character's DNA.
100%. And, like you said, it's not just that the character was available in all of these different forms. It's how formative they were on the development and the evolution of the character. The radio show gave us Perry White and Jimmy Olsen and Kryptonite. And the Fleischer cartoon, gave us flight, or at least cemented flight. We could talk about that more because I think technically he flew in the radio show.
As far as I know, it was in the radio show. Yeah, but again, I have never listened to the radio show, so I don't know a lot about that.
Again, Rich and I talked about that, and I at some point down the line on this podcast, I will do more of a deep dive into the radio show, but we did listen to the first few episodes, the first telling of the origin on the radio show. They would go on to do more, and the subsequent tellings would retcon the first one. But the first one, and this has come up now a couple of times on this podcast, but I don't mind revisiting it because it's just so bonkers. In the first radio episodes, Superman arrives on Earth in the rocket fully grown as an adult clad in the costume. And he just comes out and he saves this like father and son, and they're like, "Hey, this is great. You should go work at a newspaper and call yourself Clark Kent." And he's like, "Okay." It's so funny, but yeah, and I believe it is in that in those first episodes where it mentions him hovering in the sky. But that's the radio, right? And of course that was the way so much was consumed at the time. Nevertheless, I think once you see the character in those Fleischer cartoons on the screen, you see the character flying, even if it wasn't technically the first instance. I think that really cements it in the minds of the public at large. Like, oh, this is something he does. I'll do just a quick little explanation / show and tell for people who might be watching this on YouTube. I was a member of the Funko Legion of Collectors subscription box, and in one of them, this was a couple of years ago now, they included this little figure from Superman's first appearance. So he's clad in the costume, the version of the costume that he wears in Action Number 1, and the cardboard backing is a piece of Action 1. And that's the sort of thing that when I got it at the time, I don't know that I was all that excited about it, to be perfectly honest, at the time. Now I'm so glad that I held on to this, and I really do treasure it. And then, like I said, we'll be talking about a selection of stories. Now, how do we pick stories and where do they come from? I have a Superman in the 40s, right? So DC did these Superman by the decade trade paperbacks. They did the 40s through the 80s. I believe almost all of them now are out of print, but thanks to the owner of our old comic shop, Steve Odo, who you can find on eBay at Super Odo, that's OTO. He dug these out of the warehouse, and he brought me the 40s and the 50s. So thank you, Steve. And what's cool about, and again, I primarily focused on the 40s here, but what's cool about it is that you have introductory material and some connective tissue throughout the trade that gives you some of the historical context for what was happening. And it is, I think, a pretty nicely curated collection where this one in particular is broken down with milestones and opponents and also reflecting the sort of the changing trends, heading into the war and out of the war. So I use that as one basis for what I was going to read. And then on CBR.com, I found a relatively recent article counting down the top 10 Superman Golden Age stories. And I actually found that to be very helpful. And I sort of use that to round out my reading there. So if anyone's wondering, why we might have picked stories we did, and this is the extent of what I've read. So I don't know that I can, this is something you can answer better, but I think that the stories that we picked are representative of the time and of the specific phases of the Golden Age, would you say?
I would agree with that. The Superman in the 40s was definitely my favorite of what we read, because really you can get through the entire thing, hit the high points, and there's none of that. When you get to the end, you kind of get to the end. I didn't feel like we had to stop at a certain point. I think that's a really good collection, and I hope that goes back in print, because I think that's a version of the character that would be very popular right now. The only story that I would add in that I can think of in that list that you mentioned from CBR was the first appearance of the imp of Mr. Mixius Pitleg or whatever. I don't know if that is technically a Golden Age story, but I love that one because it's so ridiculous, but it was by Jerry Siegel. It was like absolutely canon Old Testament type thing. And I just love that story because I love the idea that the guy who created, Superman, this like He-Man action hero type, also just created these like trickster joke characters to mess with him. Like, looking back on it, there was nothing that Jerry Siegel liked to do more with Superman than just mess with him. Like, all the action and heroics, that stuff came later to the practical jokes. So that's the only one that I would tack on. It holds up. It's very funny, and it was adapted closer than you'd think for Superman the Animated Series in the late 90s.
Gotcha. Okay. That was on the list, right?
It was,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
no, it was on the list. So if
Yeah.
someone's going to Google it, it's definitely on there. But I don't believe it was in the 40s collection. I didn't see it there.
Oh, yeah. No, it wasn't in the 40s collection, and frustratingly, it's missing from the DC app. So that was one I wasn't able to read. But the 40s trade does have maybe Mixie's second appearance or something like that. Like it's pretty early on, but it's not the first one.
The things that are not on that, the app is called DC Infinite, and the things that are not on that app surprise me. The other day I was looking for Batman: The Killing Joke, arguably one of the most popular and well-regarded Batman stories. It's not on there. It's a single issue, and I had to go and dig through my long boxes. But I thought it was funny because it's like, you'd think that, if nothing else, that would be on there. So I don't know. That was a weird aside, but it struck
Don't
me.
get me started on that app. It drives me nuts. I mean, it's baffling to me. I will say this. I think it's the first 100 issues of Action are on there. Not the entire issues, but the Superman lead stories, which was great, and that was helpful for this. But the Superman title is a lot spottier. And in both instances, while the Golden Age selection is pretty solid, then it's like a huge jump to really just like some of the key Silver Age issues. Bronze is very spotty as well. The modern era is much better represented, but it's frustrating. I could go on about that, but it doesn't quite live up to its name.
Yeah,
the app. But in any event, big picture, when we talk about this era, and in particular, the first version of Superman, the version that we get, that Siegel and Schuster give us and that we spend the first few years with, really is that social crusader. And as much as I had read about that so many times over the years, it was great to really see that in action, pun intended. But he's this social crusader. He's standing up for the oppressed. He is, as you said before, nowhere near the power level that we'll see him at in the future. I mean, he's really, I don't want to say struggling necessarily, but I mean, you see him performing these tasks, and he's not juggling planets. He's not, again, he's not what we would see down the line. So he's tough. That was one of the things that I sent to you, I think, in one of my emails. I was like, this Superman's a badass. I mean, he's knocking heads, and he runs afoul of the law, in the Fleischer cartoon too. Most of the episodes end with a newspaper, the front page of the newspaper with the headline of what Superman has accomplished. And in almost every instance, it's like, Superman vanishes. Superman's still a mystery. Like there was this air of mystery around him. It was so cool.
Yeah, there are two things that I think are very important to remember when you're talking about the Golden Age Superman and how different he was from what came later. And the first is that he is absolutely an outlaw. Like, he is just an outlaw, like, full stop. Like, Clark is a respected member of society. Superman is not, and mostly because everyone's afraid of him. He does have a relationship with Lois, but it's more, he's Batman, basically. He is the caped crusader. He will punch out someone in a position of power if he feels they're abusing that power, but he is an outlaw. And then the other thing that I always point to is Golden Age Superman is not truth, justice, in the American way. He's just truth and justice. And I think that's very important to remember too, because when I say he's an outlaw, I don't mean that he's a villain. I just mean that he doesn't yet represent the establishment. He doesn't represent law enforcement. He doesn't represent the power struggles, the systems of power. He's not, he's not standing there with a badge. And I'm not saying that any of those stories that come later on that have him do that are bad. I'm just saying he didn't start that way. He ended that way. He evolved into that position. He eventually became powerful enough and popular enough and trusted enough that he was given power in his own right. But when he begins, he is only interested in the truth of the story and getting justice for those that don't have anyone to fight for them. And that, I feel like, is an incredibly powerful thing and helps to explain why this guy who again was rejected by every publisher we have a name for, suddenly took over the world and started a whole new genre and really made sure that comics, which had only been around for a short period of time, are still being read 80 years later. Like he is the reason that happened.
Exactly. And, the thing that I've really come to appreciate is, and I mean, this is not a startling revelation, but, you know, obviously the character evolves. And I think each generation gets the Superman it needs, even if it doesn't know it right at the time. And, you look at this earliest version and, born out of this Depression era and, dreamt up by these two teenagers in Cleveland. And it was Siegel, right, who had lost his father in a robbery.
Yeah, so I've read multiple versions of this story, so I don't know what is true, what is lore, what is family lore, but I do know that Mitchell Siegel, Jerry's father, worked in a shop of some sort, and one day he did not come home. And that inspired young Jerry to kind of say, well, listen, I had a great relationship with my dad, but he's gone. And I want to create a version of him who can't be gone in that way, who's going to fight and be strong and never be beaten down by anything. And supposedly that was a very instrumental reason as to where the Superman character developed from. Because Siegel and Schuster themselves, they said this in interviews, they were Jimmy Olsen. They were who Clark was pretending to be. They were not the He-Man hero type. So when Superman is wearing that costume and he's acting in that way, again, it's a little bit, I think, of wish fulfillment for these two kids, really.
That makes sense, and you could see why for those two guys and for the fans who so quickly gravitated to the character in that time, which I mean I can't imagine going through that specifically, and so to all of a sudden have a character who bullets bounce off his chest, but more than that, he's going to stand up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. It's again, you can see why that resonated, and also, what I've come to appreciate is just how different this character was, from all the pulp heroes at the time, and certainly from the other, comics that were being published. Uh, so again, I mean, I think we get the Superman we need, and the version that we started with, I think for that time, that's what was needed. And I think that helps account for why people gravitated to him the way they did. Going back to Action 1, as I said before, it's like, we know that one-page origin story, but then immediately the next page, I mean, we see Superman, he's carrying this bound woman through the night sky, drops her on the lawn of the governor's mansion, barges in, storms into the governor's bedroom, and it's like, hey, you're going to execute the wrong person. I got the real killer on your lawn. And, he doesn't take no for an answer. And, and then in Superman #1, a year later, we'll get that wrongful, about to be executed person, that whole story. We'll get that fleshed out a little bit. But that's our start. And then, his next bout of superheroics is taking care of a wife beater. And the guy faints. The guy faints before, right before Superman's like, I'm going to give you a thrashing. And the guy just passes out. I mean, again, like I said before, I think that just really sets the stage for the character and for all of the elements of the mythos that have been added over the years. And in this Silver Age in particular, and, we'll get into that next episode. But, there's like none of that in the first story and very little of that. I mean, like you said before, in the Golden Age, we'll get Mxyzptlk, we'll get Luthor, we'll get Toyman, we'll get Prankster. We'll start to get a lot of that added. But so many of these stories in the beginning in particular, it's slumlords and corrupt orphanage superintendents and thugs and corrupt politicians. I mean, that's really who he was taking on.
Stanley once said that the reason the books he worked on with his artists were different than everything else is because he wrote things that he would want to read. He didn't write for kids. He wasn't interested in that. He wrote for things to himself. I think that is even more true with Jerry Siegel, because my understanding of the man is that he was the biggest geek on the planet. He read every piece of science fiction he could get his hands on. He read every pulp adventure story. I mean, there's a lot of Doc Savage in early Superman, and he put it all into this one character, this one thing, and you can just see that all of the influences combine to create something truly new. And yeah, he doesn't go after colorful characters for a while. He fights people that I'm sure Jerry would thought, you deserve this, guys. It's the height of the Great Depression out here, and there is a war brewing in the old country. Like, you guys deserve this. And that's pretty much what Superman is. He's not a kid's character when he's introduced. I mean, this isn't, by the way, this is not, as a small aside, this is not unique to Superman. Anyone out there who's not read a bunch of Golden Age comics, they're all pretty brutal. Like, there were no real guidelines back then as to what you could and couldn't do. That would come later. That's one of the reasons the Golden Age gets kind of weird at the end, and you'll go more into that next week. But there were no real guidelines. Like, famously, Batman used to shoot people in his first couple of appearances. That's considered tame to what some of these guys got up to. So Superman definitely started with that. But I really do think Jerry was writing like, well, what do I want to read? What do I want to see? And I think that's one of the reasons those first couple of years that they're pretty harsh before it takes off. And he's like, oh, wait a second, I got to tone this down a little bit. He's got action figures.
Right. But I think that's such a big part of the charm for me of this era, that it's like, yeah, he's not this highly valuable corporate piece of intellectual property yet. It's like raw and wild, and the character was taking shape. And yeah, you didn't have those parameters like we would get with the Comics Code Authority, like you were saying, after the, seduction of the innocent and the hearings and all that business. So yeah, I mean, there's just something like really very exciting. I think there's an energy to those early stories as you see the character take shape. I think the other thing that's so powerful is that, as much as it is definite, it's a decidedly different version of the character, but the core is still there. The core of someone who is going to do the right thing and save people. Again, as much as it'll shift, the core is still there. And I think that too helps account for why the character has endured. But I'm jumping way ahead, but I don't want to forget it, because it was something that really stood out to me. In the Morrison run, I know a number of the issues had backup stories, and one of them, there was a scene with young Clark and Jonathan in the house, and one of their friends or neighbors had their truck repossessed, and Clark put it on top of the bank to mess with them. And the idea was, and Jonathan and Clark were talking about this, and Jonathan was like, yeah, like, how could you repossess, this person's truck or piece of machinery, whatever it was, right at this time, when they need it the most. And, Jonathan imparts this lesson to him, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but basically, like, there are some people who are richer or more powerful, they'll take advantage of other people because they can. And those other people can't always stand up for themselves. So you have to stand up for them. And what was so interesting to me about that, because look, I'm no stranger to a Jonathan Kent speech, and I love them. I love them all. But most of them, I think, they sort of fall into the category of, you were sent here for a reason, and you have to use your powers for good. And this isn't a 180 from that, but at the same time, that's a very specific piece of advice, right? It's not just, oh, do good. It's that, hey, there are bullies out there, and you have to stand up to them. And it's again, it is a distinction, and it was interesting to see that. Obviously, you don't see that necessarily in the Golden Age stories. You don't get a flashback to that advice, but seeing it in that Morrison run was really cool.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I think you hit the nail on the head. The key distinction between Golden Age and non-Golden Age is Golden Age, it's I protect people. That's it. I protect people who are being abused. And if they're being abused by banks, a bank is a legal structure, or whatever else, I'm going to do the right thing because I have to help people. I have to have empathy. There's one thing I kept thinking of rereading these issues, which was, I wish Golden Age Clark had been around when Luthor was president, because you and I discussed that when we did the Loeb run, and it was this idea of like, what does Superman, the ultimate example of law and order, do when his arch rival, the most evil man in the world, is legally elected president? Well, he blows off some steam in the vacuum of space, but ultimately nothing. He does nothing. And I don't feel like that would be the case for Golden Age Superman, who'd be like, nope, that guy is a gangster Nazi, and I'm going to punch him in the mouth. So I kept flashing back to that. But I love the recontextualization of John and the other background stuff in the New 52, because as much of what we know of Superman is in the Golden Age, most importantly, the identity of Clark Kent and everything we attribute to him, and Lois. Lois is right there, day one, page one. The Smallville stuff and the Jonathan and the parents and all that, none of that's there. That was all added later. And what the New 52 says, well, wait a second, there's a lot of that stuff we really like. Let's sprinkle it back in and say, well, how would that upbringing result in this different, more aggressive, but ultimately more helpful version of Superman?
Man, the wheels are turning now that you mentioned that President Luthor storyline, because you're right. And I mean, I think that was a bit of a frustration that I had with that storyline, where it's like, yeah, he really doesn't do anything. He's like, well, ultimately I respect the democratic process. It's like, but what this guy is capable of. And you're right, 100%. That Golden Age version would not stand for that. He'd be dragging Lex out of the White House. And without a second thought.
Yeah, and it wouldn't even be it would just, he'd wait until he did something evil, and then he would just drag him out. Like any other, there's a reason superheroes wear masks. It's because they're outlaws. Like, that fundamentally is what they are. I mean, I'm a Spider-Man fan, and, he spends as much time fighting the police and the newspaper and everything else as he does supervillains. So yeah, I just kept going back to that and thinking, like, I get that our modern Superman is a world power in and of himself, and he has to put certain rules on himself. I completely understand that. But the version of Superman that took Hitler and Stalin and put them in front of the world court and said, this war is over, I will punch you both in the mouth, I don't think he would have stood for President Lex abusing his power in the way he did during some of those stories.
Yeah, look, again, I don't subscribe to the most common criticisms that you hear about the character, obviously, but for anyone who feels that he's boring or a dud, read these Golden Age stories, because there's an electricity to this version of the character that you might just respond to. Let's take a quick commercial break, and then we'll come back. There's so much more to talk about. This is great. We'll be right back. If you enjoy this show, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. I also hope you'll consider joining my Patreon community. The support of my patrons enables me to produce this podcast, and patrons get rewards too, including exclusive episodes, advanced listens, and more. Sign up today and get instant access to the back catalog. Visit patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all of my patrons. I truly appreciate your support. The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. All right, and we're back, and I have one more plug to make. I recently connected with the host of the Krypton Report podcast, Tyler. Great guy. We've exchanged messages, and I just wanted to give a shout out to his podcast. So Krypton Report is a Superman-based podcast hosted by Tyler, dedicated to everything from the House of L, including TV shows, comics, movies, video games, and anything else DC related. You can find Krypton Report on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you go to their link tree, Krypton Report, you can get all of the handy links in one place. What's cool about their show is that they are more current event focused. So they're regularly talking about the latest episodes of Superman and Lois and Supergirl. And they do look back at other, stories as well. So for anyone who's looking for more Superman podcast goodness, I hope that they will check out Krypton Report. Have you ever listened, Mike?
No, I've never heard of that show before.
Yeah, well, there you go. Now you have. So, all right, we're back. We're talking about the Golden Age incarnation of Superman. And again, we cover the origin pretty thoroughly, I think, earlier on the podcast. But the one thing I always had this in my mind as I was reading those earliest stories. In Action 1, right? He's found by a motorist and brought to an orphanage. And then he just, and we don't get much else. He has these powers and he decides to be Superman. And I just always think to myself, again, going back to that idea of like this mystery around the character, like there's so much we don't know. And it's like that version of the character who grew up in an orphanage, who decides to become Superman. Just something about that I couldn't shake that as I was reading all of those stories.
It's funny because I think that is due to the fact that if you had told Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster when they were making that first version, which again was rejected many times, and we'd still be discussing this 80 years later, they'd be like, what are you talking about? No, you're not. So it was a way of kind of burning off the origin story quickly. We can look back on it now and say, well, no, we know why the character is noble and wants to help everyone. But at the time, he was probably like, well, no, I need to get to the punching because that's the interesting part. That's the gimmick. That's what's going to separate him from Popeye and Doc Savage and any other way you can spend your, nickel, whatever it was. But yeah, I think it was just, I don't think he expected this character, this franchise, to be as successful as it was. I'm sure he was happy when it took off and meant more work for the both of them, but I don't think they expected it. I mean, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster worked at National Comics on a bunch of different characters, and we are not talking about them 80 years later. If anyone were to read a reproduction of Action Comics #1, and I think Anthony mentioned this before, it's got half a dozen other characters in there. Like no one knew. Like Superman got the cover because obviously he's the most visually compelling, and Joe Shuster at his prime was great, but he was one of a dozen characters and they had to kind of play the field. So yeah, to your point, I think it was just like, we have to burn this off as quickly as possible. And an orphanage is a nice quick way of saying, well, we know he's from an alien world of super people, which is basically the future, really. Right. Krypton is written just to be the future Earth, which is something we might see one or two times in other Superman stories. But, it's just like, we have to get it out of the way so we can get to the punching. Like Jerry Siegel didn't waste panels, basically.
I agree. I think, behind the scenes that accounts for it. What's funny, and this might sound surprising for me to say because I love a Superman origin story, but at the same time, there is something mythic and elemental about like not having that. And you get the bare bones and this guy just shows up and he does what he does. There's something about that is really appealing. I mean, do I prefer that to the more fleshed out version of the origin that explains why he does what he does? No, but I do like it. And again, there's room for different interpretations. So I do quite like that this version of the character exists. Similarly, again, I can't believe I'm saying this because I've gone on record so many times, right? I like the Kents alive, generally. I like them as a sounding board for Clark when he's an adult. I like, especially before he forms a relationship with Lois and lets her in on his life, I like that he can confide in somebody. So that's my preferred version. I understand that, the death of Pa Kent can, signal the end of his adolescence and teaches that lesson that he can't save everyone. And there's value in that. So I'm sort of mixed on Jonathan's passing, but for the most part, I never quite liked this pre-crisis version where both parents die. That being said, because, with Superman 1, right, a year later, we did get a more fleshed out origin, and now he was adopted by the Kents, and upon their death, he leaves and he becomes Superman. And in the New 52 incarnation, his parents are dead. That was a big departure from the post-crisis Superman. But there, too, I don't know. I found myself more okay with it than I thought I would. I guess because I feel like his parents not being there, how do I put this? Like, it does sort of account for why he would be as, I mean, for lack of a better word, like aggressive as he is. It's like, it's almost like he has nothing to lose. And it's like all bets are off, and he's going out there and he's doing what he needs to do. And there's nothing holding him. But not that his parents hold him back, but they are a tether. And for the most part, I like that tether. It's a tether to his humanity. But at the same time, when that tether's not there and he's just unleashed, that's the version that we get. So I think for this type of Superman, it actually does. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think it does quite work if his parents aren't there. What's your take on this?
I think you're right, because in the New 52 version, we see Grant Morrison's Clark Kent speak to his landlady, and he says, the landlady discovers his secret identity, and he says to her, if you are going to blackmail me, I have no money, and more to the point, if you expose me, Clark Kent will disappear. Superman will just appear as a new identity somewhere else in the world. And I think, to what you said, part of that is he knows Ma and Pa aren't reading the Daily Planet every day, right? They're not looking to see what their son is doing. So right there in those early days before he establishes his relationship with Lois, there's no Justice League, there's no other superheroes. He can leave. He can just pick up and say, well, the mission is the most important thing, bringing down the villains, whether they be Glenn Morgan or later on Luthor or Brainiac or whatever. Bringing them down is the most important thing. And if Clark Kent's going to get in the way of that, well, John and Mary or Martha or whatever, they're gone. So I don't have to worry about that. I can go off and become Johnny Clark or, any other thing that you want. I mean, he even says in the New 52, it's like, I don't really need to eat a lot or sleep or anything like that. So it's even more, I won't say inhuman, but like a little bit more divorced. Like Clark can spend more of his waking hours of who he is towards helping people. It's almost like, again, I go back to like Batman. It's almost like he's driven by this mission that like, I am here for a very specific purpose, and it is to level the playing field because, Earth could be like Krypton if I help them out and get some of this stuff out of the way.
I will say, as we're talking about the Morrison run, and specifically for this, I read the first arc. It's collected in the is it the Men of Tomorrow? Yeah, I think it's Superman and the Men of Tomorrow trade. It's like the first eight issues. And you'll be back on the show next year, and we'll do a whole deep dive into Morrison's run on Superman. Not just in the New 52 title, but also JLA, 1 Million, All-Star, all that good stuff. But I'm glad that I really thank you for suggesting that we include it in this episode, because, I'm on record in other podcasts as saying, I was really not on board with the New 52. I sat out most of it. I remember going to alternate realities before it closed, of course, and I had my key and I let myself in the Wednesday or the Tuesday, I guess, that the books came in with Flashpoint #5 and Justice League #1. I remember letting myself into the store and digging through the boxes and finding them. And I sat there and I read, and I was just like, you know what? I just don't think this is for me. And for Superman in particular, I didn't like that. Oh, I still don't like that his relationship with Lois was wiped away. At the time, I didn't like that his parents were dead. It wasn't the version of the character I fell in love with. I grew up reading. But now, with the benefit of time and with the benefit of the context of these Golden Age stories, I look at that run now. And that's why it's like I love doing this podcast, because I look at that run and I'm like, oh, like I really get what Morrison was doing here. And, at the time it was like, well, this took the place of the Superman I liked. Now, 10 years later, which is crazy, but 10 years later, I can look at it and it's like, well, we ultimately got, quote unquote, my version back, right? And this is a story that's out there, and I'm really glad it's out there. And so now I appreciate that in a whole other way. But what I was going to say is that I really enjoyed Morrison's treatment of Clark more than he gets a much better deal than he did in the Golden Age stories, because there it's really just a disguise. He is disguise. And you look at the opening for the radio show and the Fleischer cartoon and the George Reeves show, and it's disguised as Clark Kent. And that's really what we got in the Golden Age and beyond, right? This was just, he puts on a pair of glasses so that he can blend in and, be at the newspaper where he can find out, where everything is, when things are happening. And that's kind of it. And he plays his Clark as, meek and mild and cowardly, to divert suspicion. And, there's really not much to Clark. And I feel like Morrison treated Clark a lot better. Like you said, and that jumped out at me too. You do get that line where he's like, if you out me, I'll just become someone else and Superman will appear, and it'll be fine. And it's like, yeah, is that my favorite version of the character? Not necessarily, right? But, it made sense. But that Clark was still capable and was this dogged investigative journalist, who was cracking cases and competing with Lois for stories. So I definitely appreciated the treatment of Clark more so, in the Morrison run than we got back in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s.
Yeah, Clark in the Golden Age is rough because, going just back to Action Comics #1, the reason Superman flips that car is because Lois has been taken. Lois has only been taken because Clark goes out of his way to be very, very benign and not get in the way of what proves to be a gangster. But it's kind of creepy because it's like he's really, Superman has decided Clark Kent, who I am when I'm wearing these glasses, has to be very, very different from who I am when I'm wearing this cape. So it's like, Superman is aggressive and he throws things and he does everything else. Clark goes out of his way to be meek and mild. And it's such a great gimmick because, in those issues, again, I'm not even saying you're supposed to like Superman back then, because again, you didn't always have to like these characters. The Shadow was a dick. And it establishes a love triangle. It really does, right? Like Clark Kent loves Lois. Lois loves Superman. Superman would be quite happy if she loved Clark. And it's beautiful because it's one of those narrative storytelling devices that is flawless and unchanged in nearly 80 years. And the versions that do drop it usually aren't as successful as the ones that play it up. And I can't believe it was there in the first issue. Like, it's just so much of what makes the character unique, both at the time and today, was on the page. So yeah, Clark definitely evolved into a more likable character, but there is something interesting and compelling about him as he is on first arrival.
It is interesting. And, I've never subscribed to or been a fan of the Kill Bill speech.
Right.
About how Clark is meek because that's how Superman views the human race. But I don't know. It's like, you look at some of those stories and it's like, I don't know. Is that his indictment of humanity? It's like, I don't like to think that it is. Ultimately, I don't think that's the case. I think it made for a great speech in a movie. I don't think that, that's necessarily what was at play, but it's...
Well, the person who gives that speech is also a sociopath. So
that's true.
I just want to point that out. Like, for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, in Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill Volume 2, the villain, the titular Bill, gives this speech. So he may not be the best example of what a good person with power and at least claiming to have noble intentions actually wants out of life. So I will say that.
But wait, he's Bill. He's the title character. We're supposed to root for him, right? Have I been watching it wrong? Channeling Barney Stinson there for a second. Anyway, so I want to jump back to, because it's funny. We've been talking generally, but I do want to, as we're almost an hour in, I do want to make sure we talk about some specific stories. This was #1 on that CBR list, and I think this was my favorite story. Action Comics, #8. And I said this before. I think this story in particular really captures the essence of that social crusader. Again, you see the elements of it even in Action Comics #1, but this one, when I read the description on CBR, I was like, oh, like I don't know. I just wasn't expecting that kind of story. For anyone who hasn't, it's such a good, if you read no other Golden Age stories, like go read Action. You had read this already? Was this something?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'll give the setup for it, right? So it starts with this teenager being sentenced to 2 years in juvenile detention for assault and battery. Clark is in the courthouse. He's seeing all of this unfold, and he observes this teenager's gang, his compatriots who are also there, and he follows them outside and, finds out that, they're all part of this gang. They work for this fence, and the kids go back to the fence, and they confront him because he had promised that if they ever got in trouble, he would pay for a lawyer, and he didn't now for this kid who's going away. And they want the money they've been promised, and he pushes them off, and he tells them he has these jobs for them to do, a big score. He sends them all to a different place to break in. And what Superman overhears is that after he sends them out, this Fence calls the police. He's going to set them all up just as he set up the initial kid, and he's going to make off with all the money. And it's for people who are more familiar with the later versions of the character, like this might sound so surprising, but Superman goes to all of these soon-to-be crime scenes, and he intervenes, but he saves these gang members who are going to commit these crimes. And in some instances, it's a matter of just stopping them before they move forward. But in a couple of instances, they've already been apprehended or a pursuit has started by the police. And he gets between the police and these kids, and he gets them out of the way. Going back to what you were saying before about Superman the Outlaw. And, he literally takes them under his wing. Like, he grabs them all up under his arms, and he's walking them across the telephone wires, like trying to scare them straight. And he does ultimately, get through to them and reaches them in the sense that, this is not the way to go about their lives. But again, in another very surprising and interesting turn, Superman himself realizes that they're a product of their environment. They're a product of these slums that they've grown up in, this neighborhood. And I felt like that was such a progressive view for the character to have in the 30s, right? And as much as you would expect, like, oh, Superman's tough on crime, he would round them up. It's like, no, there's some sympathy there. There's some understanding. There's some insight. And then the final turn, this made me laugh, but it was very interesting as well. Conveniently, he sees a newspaper headline that in Florida there had recently been a cyclone, and after that the government rebuilt all the houses that were destroyed. So that gives him an idea, and he tells all these kids, he's like, all right, go to your neighborhood, tell everyone to get out and grab their valuables. And after they do, he's a one-man wrecking crew, and he tears apart these tenements. And I don't think I'm mixing up stories. I think they send in the military, right, to try to stop him. But that only makes his job easier because they're like firing all these missiles and stuff, and he's just letting them hit the buildings. And then as a result, this neighborhood has been demolished. The government has to rebuild it, and everyone moves back into this like affordable, these very nice buildings that are affordable for them. And that's the story.
If you adapted that Action Comics number 8 today and people didn't know about that issue, you would think it was a version of Superman that had never existed. But yeah, this is from his first year. This is like foundational, and all of this stuff happens in what is, I don't even think, 20 pages.
No,
I mean, you want to talk about dense, and yeah, everything you said is completely accurate. Like this Superman is not a crime fighter. This is a guy who has incredible empathy. He follows the story. It's not like, oh well, the law decided and then that's it. It's like, no, wait a second, that could have been me, or that could have been someone I knew, or that could have been someone. Clearly, this kid doesn't know what's going on. I'm going to see if I can fix this because I can do all these amazing things. And again, it's like, this might be why I'm here. Maybe I do have to change things. Maybe I have to force change. It's rhetoric that we hear not usually in the superhero circles, but in like actual political and social discussion. But it's here. Like, Superman is clearly meant to be a tool of social and political change. He just does it because he's strong. So that's the only hammer he has. And to your point, yeah, he wrecks these slums. No one is hurt, but he destroys them, and he forces the powers that be to fix everything. And he's like, oh, cool, great. Well, don't let this happen again, or I will be back because you can't hurt me. And he gets to sit as this like third power. It's like, I'm not against criminals because they broke the law, and I'm not for you because you make the law. Like, we're all human, and we all have to understand the difference between us. And it's all right. It's right there from the beginning. Like, it's just, it was incredible to me the first time I read this stuff, and it's just as compelling now.
Yeah, that story, I mean, I echo all of that, and that story was such a standout. And I'm glad you mentioned it because I did want to bring this up, the density of these stories. They're all like, 10 to 12 pages, and honestly that's sufficient. I mean, these pages, they're packed. There are no full page splashes, there are no double page spreads, there's a ton of exposition. They're really packed, but at the same time, I went into this, like I said, not thinking that I would enjoy it, and also I guess sort of feeling like the storytelling sensibilities were so outdated that I just wouldn't, that I wouldn't enjoy them. And that's probably true of the later ones that we took a look at, but these early ones, I was genuinely engaged by them throughout. Even with the heavy exposition and all, but even still, like I was there, man. I was there for it.
Yeah, there's a great quote about the movie Casablanca that I like, which is, um, it's often considered the greatest movie of all time, but it actually is very good. And I feel that way about these very early Superman stories. Like, you think they're going to be a slog. You think that they're so out of date and so out of touch. And there's so many other Golden Age stories that are unreadable. But to actually sit down and read his first 2 years worth of stories, they are very good. Like, they are quick and they are fast and they are, it's called Action Comics for a Clark does not sit around and just talk about things. Like, he is running and he's jumping and he's leaping, and the visual language that Joe Shuster and the people in his studio had to develop to how to convey those stories, they did a bang up job, because Metropolis may have just started as Cleveland or New York or what have you, but like, I feel like it takes on a life of its own, and he's not. One of the things I like about the Golden Age Superman is he doesn't fly over the buildings. He doesn't fly around the world. He leaps between them, almost like Spider-Man swinging. And it really lends itself to some very compelling visuals. Like, when he's chasing a car, he's chasing. He's not flying around. He doesn't do any of his little tricks that he'll have later on. Like, this is a guy who's trying to get somewhere and get something. So yeah, I echo that. These are actually well written stories. They're not as out of date or out of touch as you'd think. Again, I feel like Jerry wrote them for himself.
Yeah. I mean, it was really a pleasant surprise. I mean, like, they're tight and punchy and they move. I promise that I don't set out to mention the Snyder movies in every episode. I really don't. I swear I don't. That being said, I remember when the first production still from Man of Steel was released. It was the shot of Superman standing in front of the vault that he had just been smashed into during the fight with the Kryptonians. And so it's him, like, standing right in front of the crushed, smashed bank vault, and he's kind of like crouched, like he's getting into an attack position, and he looks angry because he's mid-battle, and his mother was just threatened. And I remember people being like, "That's not so. He was so angry." And at the time, like, I didn't make any connection to the Golden Age, but I don't know. I see shades of the Golden Age Superman, not in every respect, but in certain respects in the Snyder movie. I think most notably the interrogation scene where, Superman surrenders himself and he's in the interrogation room with Lois, right? And he's allowed himself to be handcuffed. And then at a certain moment, this guy just gets up and he's as calm and collected as can be, but purposeful. And he's not going to sit for this any longer. And he so easily breaks the handcuffs, and he goes up to, to General Swanwick, and he's like, you fear me because you can't control me. You can't, and you never will. And it's so matter of fact, and it's so direct. And in the Morrison run in particular, Superman is captured by Luthor and the government early on. And I feel like there was some similarities in there too, just in Superman's response to them. So again, like, I'm seeing echoes, some shades of the Golden Age Superman in the Snyder stuff as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think that in the Snyder movies, Superman is not immediately trusted by the powers that are already in charge. So yeah, there's definitely shades of that there, where it's like, listen, if I have to fight you guys too to do the right thing, I absolutely will. So yeah, who knows? Maybe in a Man of Steel 2 or in a different direction, or a movie where he didn't murder war criminal. He could have possibly been engaged in that in a little bit more, but I guess we'll never know.
Look, you don't think Golden Age Superman would snap a neck if he didn't have another choice? Come on, he totally would.
No, I do. I absolutely do think that Golden Age Superman has bodies. My problem with that, not to refight this battle for the 100th time, is that Zod comes to Earth in the Phantom Zone. Put him back in the Phantom Zone. Like, that is what Golden Age Superman did 100 times. That's what Jor-El did. It's just like, you clearly want him to murder someone because it's never been done on screen before. Just put him back in the Phantom Zone.
It was the heat of the moment. There was no time. Anyway.
All right. You know more about this than I do. I only saw it the one time. I have Mark Waid's reaction. Mark Waid supposedly was screaming at the screen, "No, don't do it!" At that was my reaction. I don't remember if I left the theater. I left the theater when Batman shoots the guy in the face in Dawn of Justice.
You left the theater?
Oh, I got up and I left. Yeah,
wow.
Watching Batman shoot. I even if it was a parademon in the face, I couldn't do it. I was overwhelmed. I went out into the lobby, and our friend Mark Hammond happened to be there selling comics and stuff, and I talked to him for about 20 minutes, and then I went back in.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. All right. But as far as the Golden Age Superman having bodies, in Action 2, right? So, and also, too, in these early issues, again, he's this social crusader. He's fighting for the oppressed. There's also a very strong anti-war sentiment, and this idea that Siegel was very clear about, that war was driven by the greed of corrupt men. And so in the second issue, right, like, Superman takes this weapons manufacturer and lobbyist to this war and, like, forces him to enlist so that he could experience what war is like from a firsthand perspective, which was fascinating. Again, like, dispensing his own brand of justice. But elsewhere in that story, as Superman's flying around, like, he sees a soldier torturing in the enemy, and he grabs this guy and throws him. Now, look, we don't see the outcome. It would be shocking to me if that guy survived. I mean, like,
that guy's dead. Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah, hurled him.
Yeah,
so there was that happening. But again, big picture, and I know we've both been saying it, but I really think it is such a powerful aspect of Golden Age Superman that, the law, and we see this, the law and what's right, they're not always the same thing. And this was a character who was there to fight for what was right, even if that meant going against what was technically the law. And again, it was really interesting to see that, to experience that in these stories.
Yeah, I love that story, because Superman is just like, I am stopping this war. And normally in a story like that, you'd think he'd be on the battlefield trying to prevent people from killing each other. That doesn't even occur to him, because as far as he's concerned, everyone who's fighting this is his brother. He goes right for the top. He goes right for the people who are benefiting from it. It's such a smart, simple story. Again, it's astounding to me. It's like, this is in his second appearance. He's fighting munitions manufacturers and the leaders of opposing army in another country. And this is like before we're even in World War II. And this is a straight up, war is bad. There's no reason you should be doing this. And the story ends by him basically saying, you are the same people. You have the same stuff in common. There's no reason to be having this war. And if you don't settle it now, I'm going to settle it. And if I settle it, none of you are getting out of this in a way that's going to benefit you. So it's amazing. It's such a great story, but you have to remind yourself, this is Superman. This is the guy with crypto and with all this other stuff. Like, one became the other in a very natural evolution over decades.
Yeah, and in the stories that we read and the stories that are collected in that 40s trade paperback, you definitely do see the shift, it makes sense, right? As America is entering World War II, that this anti-war sentiment, this idea that, war is just driven by greed and all of that, doesn't really work when you have, all of, our soldiers going over there. And so you definitely saw this huge shift to propaganda, essentially. But what was so fascinating was, I don't know if this was in the trade you have or if you saw this, But there were newspapers. It was actually in the newspaper strip that they told a story that accounted for why Clark wasn't in the war. Have you come across that?
I've read it before. I didn't read it. I didn't read it for this discussion.
It was very clever though, where, Clark, not Superman, Clark is at the front of the line to enlist, right? Which I thought was interesting because it's like even meek, mild, cowardly Clark Kent, right, so supports our soldiers and wants to be there that he's going to sign up, and he's very confident because of his physique that he'll be chosen. But he gets distracted during the vision test, thinking about all the things he's going to do to help win the war, that he inadvertently uses his X-ray vision and he reads the chart from the room next to his, not his own, and as a result fails. But it was humorous, but also I think a clever way because, right, they obviously weren't going to send Clark to the war. So it was a clever way to at least account for that and to not undermine the character even further by making it that, he didn't want to.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I get that the world in 1938 or 39, when we're talking about him dealing with the munitions guy, is a very different world from when the U.S. is actively engaged in World War II. And again, I mean, I don't know if we've said this before, Jerry Siegel is a Jewish American and he is the son of immigrants. So I can't imagine what was going through his head. And I'm sure he wanted to write stories where Superman ends the war, but unfortunately, that doesn't lend itself to recurring stories. And at that point, he was doing very well for himself and for Joe. So yeah, he had to come up with a way around it, and he did that. But yeah, there's the story in Look magazine where he does confront Hitler, which I thought was a nice consolation prize.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like the Look magazine, it's a two-page story where he rounds up Hitler and Stalin, and he brings them to the the World Tribunal, and that's it. And I think, yeah, there is definitely some wish fulfillment there. I mean, I get why they, like you said, that, having Superman end the war in continuity, like, doesn't lend itself to ongoing storylines. But also, I don't know if it would have been disrespectful or would have undermined like the sacrifices that were being made. And so many of the soldiers followed the adventures of Superman and the character was an inspiration. So I think ultimately it makes sense. Like, I get why they went the route that they did, where Superman is a champion of the soldiers, but he defers the fighting of the actual war to them. And his is a battle fought, for the most part, in America, fighting saboteurs and Nazi sympathizers and stuff like that. And we get a number of stories in that vein. I think one of the stories that was on the CBR list, I believe, is Lois is on a boat. Yeah, it was on that list. I think it was Action 62. Where she's on a boat and they're captured by Nazis and Superman rescues them. So, you got stories more in that vein.
Yeah, it's not like they ignored it. It's not
No.
like they said, well, this conflict isn't happening. It's just they had to deal with it in different ways because, having Clark actually in the battle wasn't what they were looking to tell. Also, a lot of other comics were doing that. I mean, Captain America, if nothing else, was literally like, I am enlisted, serviceman Steve Rogers, and I'm going to be fighting this battle. So.
Yeah. And then again, it's at this point where we do start to get these, we do get this shift, right? Where Superman now becomes more a symbol of the status quo or of the establishment. And we get a more gentle and benign Superman. He's not quite the, the bat out of hell that he is in the early stories. And like one of the stories that's collected in the 40s trade is Superman visits soldiers training right at their base, and he participates in drills and maneuvers, and he's just throughout the story he's just so in awe of our soldiers and everything they can do. And again, I mean, it makes sense, but yeah, the stories, I guess, from around that point forward, lost the teeth. I think they really lost, a bit of that electricity and energy that they had in the beginning. Did you find that as well?
Yeah, I did, and I mean, it's unfortunate because I don't really think you could tell stories during that period of time where the hero of what is supposed to be a kid's story is attacking, the established order, the order that is fighting the Axis powers and the war in the Pacific and all these other things. Like it, I think would have been perceived as unpatriotic, and certainly that's not what they were doing. I mean, Superman couldn't have foreseen World War II, but once it was going on, like clearly they were like, well, wait a second, we have to make sure that we pivot, if you will. But also the other thing that was going on around that time is by the time World War II is in high speed, Superman's got a bit of a rogues gallery. I mean, he's no longer limited, if you will, to just fighting the real world menaces that Jerry Siegel was reading about in the newspaper or seeing in his own life. He had recurring, very colorful, very fanciful characters that was allowing Superman to become more fantastic and really, again, differentiate himself in other ways because, especially at that time, he probably had one of the richest rogues gallery. I mean, Luthor alone obviously was very good both his iterations back then. But I mentioned before about how much I love that Mixius Pitleg story, but it's like Toy Man, Prankster, everyone else. It's like that's what Jerry and Joe brought to the table. So it really helped differentiate it. Once it's like, well, you can't fight the police anymore. It's like, oh, okay, great. I'm going to fight supervillains for a while, and we'll make sure that they don't do anything that would allow the Axis to get the upper hand.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I mean that certainly tracks. And, especially, unlike other wars in more recent history where, there's been more of a question about whether we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, you look at World War II and there was very clearly like the good guys and the bad guys. And it's like, yeah, if America is entering this war and is emerging from this war as the world leader, it's like for Superman to still sort of be bumping up against that. Yeah, I don't know that would have really played or resonated. So, again, I think it makes sense and we can account for why that happened. And yeah, to your point, I mean, we were a few years in at that point as well. So it's like the mythology is evolving a bit. I mean, not to the extent that it would in the Silver Age where we have all these elements that are added, but
well, the Silver Age, there's something complementary there too. You mentioned before the comics code. Once the comics code is fully up to speed during the Silver Age, he can't fight any of these elements. Right. It's very specific about that. The code's not around anymore, but it's like, yeah, I don't think you could fight gangsters. You couldn't fight the police, obviously. And that was absolutely a no-no. So it was one of these things too, where it was like, well, we're going to publish Superman and Action Comics and Superboy every month. So you writers and you artists are going to need to come up with big threats because, our hands are tied. We can't do what we used to do. And we defeated the Nazis. So, we have to tell very interesting stories. That's one of the reasons the Silver Age is the Silver Age. It's different, but it's no less successful when it comes to ideas. I mean, they just rapidly expand the world because they have to, because they have new artistic constraints. And yeah, I mean, you can see how the character we're talking about from 1938, 1939 really does evolve into the version that's going to fight Brainiac and Discovery as a cousin and get a dog. And I love the dog, but it's all those that stuff that you really would have difficulty reconciling with, again, the version from Action 2 that just stops a war by pulling two generals at a table like he's Doctor Who and just being like, deal with this now.
Yeah. 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 No, I think that's spot on. But yeah, in those early stories, I mean, there's definitely, a lot to do with, urban development and infrastructure. And like one of the stories, it's not Ultra Humanite's first appearance, but going back to, the growing rogues gallery. So like Ultra Humanite was kind of plagued him for a run of issues, I believe. The one that was collected in the trade was Action 14, which I think was his second appearance, but it starts with, Superman investigating a subway collapse, something like that. And he tracks down the guys who are responsible and he's following them in a car. And all of a sudden the car becomes invisible. And it took me out of it for a second because, again, the first few stories that I had been reading, again, it's the wife beater, it's the war, it's the broken dam, the dam that breaks. I think that's Superman 3, I want to say, something like that. It was an early issue of Superman where Lois is investigating a story, a dam breaks, he has to rescue her. So all of a sudden we had like a somewhat fantastical development here with the invisible car, and it leads to the Ultra Humanite. So yeah, like it was interesting even just to see that. But again, like starting from that perspective of like, again, and then there was another story with the subway as well, where there were shoddy materials that were used, and it turned out that the head of the subway department was corrupt. There was like a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah, I love the Ultra Humanite. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Ultra Humanite is He's basically the first supervillain, really. I mean, if you want to frame it that way. So he was a bald, brilliant, amoral, mad scientist who was in a wheelchair and whose form was crippled. But like later versions of Luthor and of Dr. Sivana, who fought Shazam, he could create any scientific wonder the story called for. He could make your car invisible. He could build whatever was needed. But he was the first, and he shows up and he plagues Superman. And the dichotomy is very simple and very elegant, which is the Ultra Humanite is he can't do any of the amazing things that Superman can do. He has no physical resources. His body has betrayed him for whatever reason, and Superman can do all these amazing things. So the Ultra Humanite is using his mind, and his mind is unlimited. And it's just this very basic, very iconic struggle that we will see mirrored, for the next couple of decades with Luthor, obviously a very similar but separate villain. And it's so raw because, to your point, you don't expect the science fiction setting, but once it arrives, it kind of makes sense because it's like, oh yeah, there's only so many natural disasters and shoddy workmanship and gangsters that Superman can fight before he has to deal with something bigger. And what I like about that too is it kind of explains why Superman slowly becomes more powerful because his enemies are getting stronger. The world around him, the world that he operates in, is getting weirder and stranger and more complicated, which helps explain why Superman, who starts off really just as a strong man, gets more abilities and more allies and more everything else. It's like his threats help him grow as a character in a franchise.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, kind of on that note with his power level, early on, and I want to tie this to the George Reeves show because this first season of that show is very much kind of cut from the Golden Age cloth in terms of the character. He is much more quick-tempered and direct, and he engages in fisticuffs with the gangsters and thugs he's fighting, just as in the early comics. And then in the TV show, it gets softened considerably in the subsequent seasons as it moved deeper into the 50s. And, at most he would karate chop one of the bad guys. And even in the later episodes, you would barely get that. It was enough that he just showed up and he would grab them and that would be it. But in the early season, in the earliest episodes, I mean, he's fighting, like he's fist fighting with these people. So interesting to see that shift. But on the note of the powers, I want to make sure that we do talk a little bit more about the Fleischer cartoon. There too, that's something that I had seen, probably not all. I mean, there were 17, right? It was 9 that were done by the Fleischer studio directly, right? And then the subsequent 8 by the Fleischer studio successor, Famous Studios, after the Fleischer brothers had their falling out. I think that was the basic history of it. But these were theatrical shorts of, just under 10 minutes in length. And again, I had seen probably a good chunk of them before and I admire them. I think my impression all these years was like, wow, the animation was really impressive for the time. And that's still what I feel about it, but I've really come to appreciate them even more now. I rewatched maybe about a handful of them before our conversation here. But they are way ahead of their time, but just the fluidity of the motion in these cartoons, I mean, it's really astounding. I mean, you compare it to cartoons from the 60s, and it's like this blows them out of the water. And you sent me a YouTube video, which was really interesting, where the YouTube video creator, was kind of explaining why these were so sophisticated and how they continue to stand apart from other animation, the rotoscoping animation technique that the Fleischers developed, and the budget as well. I mean, so Paramount, right, came to them wanting to do a Superman cartoon, and the Fleischers, according to the articles I read, didn't want to do it, and so they quoted like this crazy high episode fee, assuming that they would be denied, and instead they were like, okay. And so there was a ton of money that went into these, but I mean, they are just gorgeous, and they really, for the most part, they stand the test of time. And I think one of the reasons I never really fully dived into them, there's not there's not much. I mean, there's no character development. There's very little dialogue. They're almost entirely action driven. But now I can appreciate that more, and I know going in that it's like, yeah, no, I'm not there to see, Clark wrestling with his role in the world. It's like, I'm going to see him fight a dinosaur, and it's going to be rendered, it's going to be rendered beautifully. And we're going to see the action conveyed in a way that, is so impressive. So I really am a fan of those. And I know you've been a fan of those for a long time, right?
Yeah, no, I same with you. As a kid, I was like, oh, those are important, right? And they were some of the inspiration for Bruce Timm and Paul Dini doing time in the animated series too. But yeah, it wasn't until I actually sat down and watched them and really focused on them and began to appreciate the context that they were created in that I realized how revolutionary they were. And yeah, to your point, there's no character development here. There's very little dialogue. Every episode can be watched pretty much, divorced from the others. There's Perry, there's Lois, there's Superman, there's the villain of the week, and there's just going to be, this brutal physicality. He fights robots, he fights mad scientists that shoot energy beams. He just they set up a problem that Superman is going to fix with how strong and determined and passionate he is about it. And then, Lois being in danger makes it personal and ups the stakes. But yeah, for what they are, they're very good at that simple premise. I mean, to your point, the way it's animated and everything else, I mean, these look great today in 2021. Never mind, I can't imagine what they would look like in the 30s. But the other thing that I really like about them is the way they show Superman's abilities and his powers. It's not that he gets shot at or that something hits him and he just stands there and he waits until it's his turn and then he effortlessly dispatches with them. Like he struggles, and he is animated, like falling down, getting back up, pushing through things. There's one frame in the video you're talking about where you actually see him like kick off a building to kind of get his flight. This is not a Superman who can kind of hover off the ground almost like a Christ-like figure. Like this is the one who's got to like crouch down and jump and leap, and you see the arcs his flight takes. It's just animated beautifully well. Nothing, as far as I could tell, is reused or anything like that. Like they got in and they did 17 amazing episodes and then they dropped the mic. So I think they held up very well. I watched a handful of my favorite ones before this discussion, and I was riveted. I mean, I watch a lot of crap in these things. I think they hold up very well.
They do. I mean, for anyone who hasn't watched them or hasn't watched them in a while, I really do recommend them. And exactly to your point about they really put him through his paces, and you really see him work. I think I want to say it's the third one, but the runaway train, with the money that's going to the mint. And, it's like there's this whole sequence where he's pulling the piece of the train, that's falling, like he's pulling it while he's being shot at, and he loses the train at one point and he's got to go and grab it. And he like literally pulls it into the station. And it's like, man, like, again, this guy was working, but yeah, it's they're so good. I mean, like I said, I watched about a handful. I do plan to watch the rest of them, and you definitely do see, in the art style and again, I think in the way that a lot of the action is conveyed, you do see the influence on the Bruce Timm cartoons and the Superman animated series in particular. I'm sure we talked about this before. I don't remember, but have you seen Bruce Timm's original Fleischer-inspired designs for Superman the Animated Series?
I think so, but not enough that I call them while we're talking.
Yeah, no, that's quite all right. For anyone who wants to see, I mean, you can probably search for them. They're also on the Digging for Kryptonite Instagram page. This was like one of my first posts, and I'll repost it when this episode comes out. But initially Timm was planning to really evoke the aesthetic of the Fleischer cartoons. I mean, it wasn't exactly the designs, but it looked much closer to that than what we ended up with. And I don't, it's funny. I feel like, especially to appeal to an audience of kids in the 90s, like they probably went the right way.
Yeah.
But part of me is like, damn, like it would have been so cool even just to see an episode in that style. Cause it was like a bit of a blend of, a more modern style with the Fleischer It was cool. It was cool to see. So anyone who wants to check that out, again, go to the Digging for Kryptonite Instagram or just search for it. It is out there. Really interesting. But yeah, that was the original intention for that, was to really, kind of bring back that style, which was interesting.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, the Superman the animated series from the late '90s is very similar to what we're talking about. Like Superman was much less powerful than he
Yep.
was in the comics at the time. He couldn't breathe underwater. He couldn't breathe in space. He had to get a lot of help from his friends and allies. Like he got put through his paces far more, which I remember a lot of us, myself included, were confused about because in the comics at this time he was very, very strong. He was very powerful, and obviously in the Christopher Reeves movies or Reeves movies, he'd turned back time and done all this other stuff. So it was a bit of an adjustment. And yeah, and I think if they had gone full Fleischer, people might have been like, why are you calling this character Superman? This is not Superman.
Yeah. And the Fleischer cartoon, the George Reeves show, Superman the animated series, I mean, they all follow that template of, the core group at the planet, investigating stories, and then of course Superman is needed. And again, it is not this godlike Superman. It is a much more down to earth character. The other thing that they all do that is always funny is the sort of the wink to the audience, right? Where Lois will make some crack about Clark, like, oh, like I guess you were too nervous to come today. You missed Superman, and he was, and he always has some comeback, or it's like, how did you get here so fast, Clark? I flew, and that look to the camera and that wink, and there was a charm to that, because I feel like especially and they did that in the animated series, right? I feel like there were not all the time, but I feel like there were some instances of that.
Yeah, because he and Lois are definitely not together. So there's a bit of that, like, oh yeah, I get around, I get along, but yeah, I don't think the Clark in that show had a lot to do. He spent a lot of
Yeah.
time in his costume, though Martha and John were there, which were nice.
Right. But again, just that idea of sort of that breaking the fourth wall and that like wink to the audience, it's effective because, and especially for kids, but even for adults, it's like it pulls you in, like you're in on it with Superman, with Clark. So there is something to that. Going back to, but anyway, so the Fleischer stuff, phenomenal, and again, like I was really just thinking about like what it must have been like to be a kid or an adult, in the 30s in the movie theater, seeing those, those 8 or 9 minute shorts before a movie, and how, as much as you had the comics, which is visual, right, and you had the radio show, which brings it to life in a different way, to see those cartoons, to see the character animate, like literally and figuratively animated, I feel like that just helped cement who this character is and what he can do. And again, just like we were saying before about this idea of flight, which ends up becoming an indelible part of his set of powers. So yeah, the Fleischer cartoons, I've come to appreciate their place in the canon, even more so now taking a look at these Golden Age stories. Jumping back to the comics, there's one story that I only mentioned, just I alluded to it briefly, but there's a story where there's a corrupt superintendent of an orphanage, and this kid escapes and he passes out from hunger on the train tracks, and Clark happens to be walking by and is able to save him as Superman. And we find out that this superintendent is not feeding the kids and is making them work and beats them. I mean, it's horrendous. And again, it's the sort of story I would not have expected to see in a comic. But like you were saying before, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's like the gloves were off in the 30s. It wasn't what we would get, later in the 40s and 50s and later. And so Lois and Clark investigate, and there's also a fun bit where there's a rivalry with reporters at another paper, and they follow them to the orphanage and all that stuff. And of course, ultimately, they get this corrupt superintendent who sets fire to the orphanage. I mean, this guy is like, completely heartless. But again, another interesting, example of, again, that social crusader and a very real world problem. And I'm sure there were a lot of kids, whether they were in an orphanage or just they were in a bad home environment, who saw a story like that where it's like Superman rescues them. And, I'm sure that really struck a chord with a lot. As I was reading that story, though, this was in the Superman title. So at that point, it had now been established that he was adopted by the Kents. But I couldn't help but think, if we had gotten that story a year earlier, the idea of dealing with a corrupt orphanage from a Superman who grew up in an orphanage, there might have been something there. But again, that wasn't the specific, incarnation that we were dealing with.
Yeah, but what you're saying is so perfect, because it's Superman is fighting people who are in positions of power where they should be using that to help people. I mean, this guy runs an orphanage, and clearly Jerry Siegel had Clark Kent be raised in an orphanage at some point in the near past. So the idea that Jerry would go back, or again, whoever wrote it, I'm just assuming it's Jerry, but it's like, this person was charged with protecting children, and one of them at one point was Clark, and now he's here, and you're misusing your ability, and now you've fallen in his crosshairs. Like, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to prevent Superman from stopping you. And it's so purposeful, and it's almost personal, because it's like, I can't believe you're doing this. And these types of stories, this theme comes up again and again and again, where it's not just external threats. It's not just cigar chewing gangsters or rogue aliens or something like that. It is, the villain of this story is the guy who runs the orphanage. Like, it's a really brutal story, but it also makes it much more compelling, because this kid is like, hey, thank you very much for the meal and making sure I didn't die, but I do not want to go back to that place that I'm supposed to be safe. And to your point, I can't imagine how many people reading this who kind of related to both the kid and to Clark ultimately making sure that everyone was safe. It probably hit home.
Yeah. So, I mean, and there are obviously many more examples, but, when we talk about those early stories and this crusader for the oppressed, I mean, that's what we're talking about. We've been going for over an hour and a half, so I don't want to keep you or our audience too long, but so of course, as we move deeper into the 40s, right? Again, as we said before, we do get this shift, very, pro-America, very patriotic, and the stories do get sillier in a lot of respects. The 40s trade and the introductory material, it talks about how, especially for soldiers who were coming back from the war, I guess the idea was this would help them. They were going through this difficult transition, like returning to, the domestic life. And so the idea that we would have Superman dealing with more of these, sillier domestic situations would help them as well, which I thought was interesting. One of the stories, and I forget the exact year, but man, the story stood out. It's where Lois is so lovesick over Superman. He takes her to a therapist who prescribes that she transfer her feelings of love from Superman, who's unattainable, to a normal man. And they settle on Clark, because she goes through some of the other people. Like, Perry's married. There's someone else she mentioned at the planet who's not a viable option, and lands on Clark. But she says, like, I don't know if I feel that way. And the therapist says, force yourself. And then in the next panel, he says, that'll be $10, please. And you're an accountant. I know you'll appreciate this. I was like, well, all right, so that's in the 40s. I said, what would that be today? It's about like $200 for that advice, which I guess is not so, I thought it was going to be a lot higher, but I guess it's not so crazy for a therapy session, but that's a steep price to pay for that advice, I think. And so she goes about, throwing herself at Clark, who, you would think this is what he's always wanted. He's always asking her out on dates, but he's like, this is getting in the way of me being Superman. He's like, I got to get rid of her.
He's caught completely off guard. He doesn't know what to do with it. And I love it. This is what I was saying before. Like, this dynamic arrives fully formed. And when you play with one of the sides, it gives you a great story where Clark is suddenly like, wait, you are interested in me? Oh, well, I don't know what to do with this. It's just, it's great. It's just one of those things where I don't know if you could get away with a story like that only a few years later.
Yeah, it was, again, I'm glad that was included. It was very, very funny. I was telling my wife about that after. She was like, what? I was like, yeah. So that was, there was that one. Like I said, I didn't have access to the first Mxyzptlk appearance, but there is an early appearance of his that is collected that I read where he, quote unquote, teams up with Lois's niece, Susie, who's prone to telling tall tales. And I mean, I don't. Do you want to give the background on this one, because I've done a couple of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story about this little kid and this imp from the fifth dimension, and the way the imp is defeated is his name has to be said backwards by himself. So Clark always has to outthink him because he'll never be stronger or faster than him. He can manipulate reality. At one point in the story, Superman teams up with the little girl to convince the imp that, hey, part of your home dimension from your home planet from the fifth dimension is on the outskirts of the city. We should go there together. And you see Superman like very quickly building the most like ridiculous playground-esque place, and it's supposed to be the imp's home planet. And it's just this completely ridiculous story where Superman's like, I can't punch you, so I'm going to have to outthink you. And if it means teaming up with this little girl, well, then so be it. That's how we're going to deal with it today.
But the kicker of this, right, is like Superman builds his best approximation of the fifth dimension, and then he destroys it to make Mixie think that Mixie is losing his mind. And then he's like, all right, well, like, you must, like, your sight must, oh, that's what it was. It's like, you must be, like, losing your eyesight. Yeah. And so, like, he, like, tricks Mixie into reading all of these faraway signs. And on one of them is written his name backwards. And that's how he's able to, to trick him into going back. But this super construction that Superman performs calls to mind another of these later stories. And that trade also has the first appearance of Toyman. So again, we're not dealing with the heavy hitters in the Rogues Gallery, except Luthor, right? We talked about earlier, but
who's not even Luthor.
Lex.
I mean, really, he's.
But so the story I'm talking about featured a character that honestly I was not familiar with before this project. J. Wilbur Wolfingham, the con man.
Oh yeah, okay.
All right. Which I guess he had made a number of appearances. Again, I was not familiar with him, but in this story, it's, I think, Journey to Ruin. And the con is he promises all these wealthy people, if there's 4 of them, and if they each pay him $250,000, he will put them in suspended animation, invest their money so it will grow, and then they'll wake up in the future. And Superman, overhears this, so he knows what's going on. And so to teach them all a lesson, he also knocks out the con man, and he builds a future city, or neighborhood at least, and hires actors. Like, he goes to a local theater and he hires all these actors. But to teach them a lesson, the whole thrust of this new world that he's built for them is that everyone had the same idea they did. To like, put themselves in suspended animation, not deal with the problems of today, not put in the work today, put it off until tomorrow. And as a result, their money has grown, but money's worthless. There's nothing to buy anymore. No one's making things. No one's inventing things. And they're all like, oh no, what have we done? And so in order to like complete this illusion, he destroys the city. Meanwhile, it's like people could have lived there. It was crazy to me, but it was interesting to meet this con man character who was, somewhat a member of the Rogues Gallery. That might be, generous, but he was a character. But also, I've always been kind of hard on the Christopher Reeve movie series, the version of Lex in particular, with his real estate schemes. It's like always real estate with this guy. But I don't know. Now I read some of these stories. It's like Superman's tearing down neighborhoods. He's building them. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe this is kind of like a common thread here.
Why not, right? I mean, real estate developers are always, good villains and bases for Lex in some continuity. So it makes sense. But Superman just teaching people lessons in the most harsh, brutal way possible is always great, because it's almost like he takes it so personally. It's like to what you said, it's like he's like, how dare you not want to work and not want to invent and not want to be novel and just sit down and watch other people do it. It's like he takes that in a personal offense, and that feels like a very honest sentiment of the time, where it's like, no, we're all working, we're all in this together. There's so much nonsense going on. It's like, how dare you sit back and think you're going to be exempt from this? It's like, if we all work together, we might actually accomplish something here. So the things that could get Superman angry and personally invested enough to build these fake worlds. It's like, again, they're coming from a very honest and real place. It's not the external threat. It's not something that is outside the realm of what the reader might go through. Here, it makes sense. It's like, oh, I just want to invest and live off of it. I just want to have money and not have to do anything. It's like, I imagine the people reading these strips were like, yeah, forget those people. Yeah, Superman, teach them a lesson. Yeah, definitely do what I can't do against people who've got, all this privilege and no ambition.
Yeah. Again, we could probably do another hour, but the last story that I just want to mention is the Superman story, I believe it's called, where Perry assigns all of his reporters and a photographer. It's not Jimmy Olsen, but it's Joey Crane. Is that the character's name? I want to say something like that. Yeah. To spend a day with Superman, and whoever comes up with the best story wins. And Superman begins his day with his exercise, like he's swims across the Atlantic and he's doing all this stuff. And then he goes about his superheroics, and it's, rescuing miners and, again, building a new neighborhood for people who are going to be displaced, and dealing with an unscrupulous landlord or property developer, basically bringing in snow for like children's Olympics, stuff like that. And the photographer keeps missing all of these events because Clark didn't show up for this day, and the photographer was trying to find out if Clark was okay, and he ends up being late, and he misses everything. But the very nice postscript to this episode, it was a very heartwarming story. At the end, the photographer wins because he shows up after, and he takes these photos of everyone whose lives have been changed by Superman. So it's not so much the feat of the superheroics that's the story, it's what he is doing for people and the effect that it has. And I really did think, look, it didn't have the teeth and the punch of the earlier stories, but there was something very, very poignant about that. I like that one a lot.
Yeah, that's great. And to your point, I think that comes across with all these stories. It's like Clark is not doing this for personal gain. He's doing this because he does want to help people, and he feels like he has this great power, so he can do a little bit more than most, and he can punch out the bigger guys because they're not going to be able to hurt him. So yeah, I think all the best stories are about how he makes other people's lives better. And I think that carries over after the golden age is done, because I think that is a fundamental aspect of Superman. It's like he's doing this for other people. It's why last time you and I spoke, we said there's not a lot of good last Superman stories. And I think I said something along the lines of, well, yeah, why would he want to stop doing this? He likes what he does. He has a wife and he has a family and he has friends, but he likes helping people. And obviously people are always going to need help because not everyone is like him. So yeah, I love seeing that is there from early on. Like Clark doesn't need to be taught that helping people is the right thing to do by anyone. I mean, the Kents aren't even there to begin with. It's there. And I think that comes across from the creators. I think that's very much how Jerry, Joe, and the others really were.
But side note, is the wire from your headset rustling up against anything by any chance?
It might be. I'm going to hold it.
The listeners, I'm sure appreciate. And, as much as like we've skipped over the origins because I've covered it previously, it wasn't until the 10-year anniversary on Superman 53 that we got like a full proper telling of the origin. And unlike, there was one panel in Superman 1 where, there's a mention of the parents, basically instilling values in him. We get that fleshed out more in that origin telling where, Pa on his deathbed is like, you have to help people. You're a Superman. And, so, that all of that does get fleshed out more. But like I said before, I don't know, there is something really effective. And I find myself surprised that I feel this way because I do like when we get the origin fleshed out, but there is something effective about him just sort of like appearing and being shrouded in that mystery and vanishing after he, accomplishes his superheroics. It's a really cool take on the character. Were there any other of the stories that we read that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that we do?
Before we do that though, the story you're talking about, the 10-year anniversary where we see Superman's origin. So That was written by Bill Finger, who is the co-creator of Batman and Green Lantern and pretty much any other Golden Age character that we're still talking about. He was amazing, and he was underrated in his time. But he did a fair amount of Superman stories, and that was one he did, and that was reprinted in a variety of the different works that we did today. So, anyone out there, if you ever want to read a Golden Age story for any character, and you can look up online if it was written by Bill Finger, it's probably going to be good. Again, everything you like about Batman probably came from him. He wrote this story. He kind of outlined the version of Superman's origin we're still talking about. And that is the tip of the iceberg about what this man gave to the industry. But yeah, the story that I wanted to talk about that I had never read before this reread was the first appearance of Superwoman, where Lois Lane imagines that she has powers. And I really enjoy that for a bunch of reasons. One, I love Lois. I think she's a great, great character. I think she's very interesting. And I love how in Action Comics, the early ones, she is uh, she is part of the story. She is not a damsel. She is not passive in any way. She stands up to the crooks. She stands up to the villains. She yells at Clark for having less of a spine. And again, I don't know what to compare her to of the time, but I have to imagine that this was atypical of heroines, certainly when your name's not on the masthead. So I love that Lois was compelling right from the start. And this issue where she becomes Superwoman, she imagines that she is getting a blood transfusion from Superman. She gets all of his abilities. She puts on a costume very similar to what Supergirl would wear later on, except she also has pants, which I thought was great. And she just goes out there and she starts doing things the way she imagines Superman would. And at no point does she say like, "Hey, you got to stop doing this," or we're anything other than equals. It's just great. She just wakes up, she gets great power, and she's like, "I want to help people too." And that was a story where I just found like, oh, no wonder Lois is unchanged from how we know her today. Like she's always been this incredible force in his life, and that's another thing that comes from the creators. She was based on Jerry Siegel's eventual wife, Joanne Siegel. So again, like that passion that comes from a real place, and it's very honest, and I feel like it worked through into the art.
Well said. Yeah, that was a standout story as well. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I know. I mean, we talked about Lois a decent bit, but there's so much more to say. And I know we only touched on Luthor. I do plan deep dives into those characters later on in this podcast series. So that's something that we'll continue to come back to. But listen, I want to thank you for joining me for this. And I thank you for your enthusiasm for the Golden Age. It's funny because, so this is the first of a trilogy of episodes. So next, in 2 weeks, we'll have Rich Roney back. We'll talk about Silver Age. And then 2 weeks after that, I'll have a guest named Bernie. And he and I are going to be talking about Bronze Age Superman. And it's funny because this is the oldest time period, and out of the three people who are going to be talking pre-crisis Superman with me, you are the youngest, and you were so quick. You were so quick. I want to do Golden Age Superman. But it's funny because I just before we sat down to record this, I posted a photo of that Golden Age Superman figure on social media, and like a lot of people commenting about like how much they like Golden Age Superman. I feel like it's something that isn't always discussed as much. I think Silver Age Superman really tends to steal the spotlight, but it's nice to know that there are Golden Age fans out there, and maybe this episode will make a couple more. That would be kind of cool, because it's definitely something that I think deserves to be read and appreciated. I think in the end, obviously the character had to evolve in order to endure, but at the same time, if we didn't have that earliest version of Superman, I don't know if the character is still around today.
Yeah, I agree. There was something in that very early, very raw version of the character that connected with everyone. Because to go back to what you said before, he is an immediate super success, and he gets all these adaptations and all this wealth, and there is a reason for that. And yeah, that character has to evolve to endure, as you said very well. But there is something there on arrival, and it connected with a great many number of people. And I know that for me, of overcoming the stereotypical Superman is very boring thing, it was going back to these and saying, whoa, wait a second, he wasn't always he wasn't always the way that I was introduced to him. He used to be this other thing, and this other thing was really interesting. And yeah, I feel like if people know about this stuff, they love it. The problem is that most don't, because it's not a version of the character that DC seems all that interested in. The Grant Morrison run did not last that long, unfortunately. And again, that version of the character was actually written out of continuity completely and replaced with the version of the character that you and I had grown up with. And again, that's fine. I mean, if that's what they need to do to have the story. But I think that when you come to these early texts, and I mean, you're a perfect example, it's like there's something there for everyone.
For sure. So listen, thank you again for being part of this. Thank you to our audience. Make sure you come back in 2 weeks for our Silver Age discussion. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Greg Schiegel, music by Basic Printer. Join the conversation by becoming part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group. Follow Digging for Kryptonite on Instagram and Twitter, and visit flatsquirrelproductions.com to explore more of my film and podcast projects.